All right. So we're back again. This is common troubleshooting tips for domains. And to be honest, this is going to be kind of a jam-packed session here in terms of little topics we're going to cover. So yeah, put your seatbelts on. You may need it. We're going to talk about basically we'll show a couple things that are real common problems that may happen with a site or an account, or just like talk about a couple administrative things that you may want to know about. All of the things I'm going to show are covered in documentation as well, and they're linked on the session page. So I'm going to actually be referencing that quite a bit, and so you'll be able to kind of see that as I go here. But exactly here, let me get my screen up here. I'm a little bit disorganized at this point. So I just wanted to mention, if you click on the common troubleshooting tips for domains session in the headless or in the workshop site, that's going to have all the documentation I'm talking about, and I'm sure we'll put a lot of it in Discord as well. So the first thing I kind of wanted to start with is a doc we have called Common Troubleshooting Fixes. So a few things to mention in here is password, IP addresses, in case you have folks working with DNS, and cache clearing. These are like the first things anytime any of your users are having trouble with the site, to make sure that these things are good. Is their browser cache the issue? Is their IP address the issue? In case it's like DNS related, someone can link the like DNS flow chart. Like, was the problem DNS? No, I don't know if anyone knows what I'm talking about, but it's always DNS flow chart. And sometimes that's only going to be relevant for your users, mostly if they're using top level domains, or if they're mapping a top level domain into their account. And then, can they log in, and do they have access to that? So a couple things, and I'm gonna try to do almost all of this from the WordPress front end, because I think most of the time that's the easiest way to get in to help your users, especially in the case of you've got a user who maybe wants to do this themselves. Like, you can send them some instructions. In certain cases, that's maybe what you want to do. So I actually have 3 State U accounts, and I have to pick the right one here because 2 of them are expired. But so if you're in your WordPress front end, you can switch to the user that needs help. And once you're in their cPanel, you'll note that their IP address, that was one of the things I mentioned, right? Their IP address is always going to be on the right side of the cPanel. So that's always available to you there. That's the IP of the server that their account is on. So if they're pointing like an A record or doing some DNS stuff, that's what they need. The password. So there's a couple different types of passwords in the domain of one's own that they may need. Of course, if we're talking about the user can't go to your main domain site, so like in this case stateu.org, and they can't log in there, that's likely single sign-on if your institution is using that, and most are. So at that point, whatever change password process your institutional accounts use would be the thing. But if they're needing to do something like they can't log into their WordPress site with credentials, they can always do that stuff from the My Apps tab in Installatron, right? So all they have to do is go to My Apps, and they can click on the configuration button, and they can set a password right from there and hit update, and that will change a WordPress password. The other type of password that comes up really often is a cPanel password, and that's probably less often for most domain of one's own users, but that is something that you actually would have to change in WHMCS. For the user. The only types of users who are probably needing a cPanel password is if they're using SFTP to like manually move files into their account with a client like Transmit or CyberDuck or something like that. So that is available to you in WHMCS. So this is one of the few things that I will have to do from WHMCS. So if I look for my account on State U, and I click on the person in the account, I can just go to the products and services tab, and the password is actually in plain text here. So we'll wait for this site to get hacked now that everyone can see the password here.
Change it.
But yeah, I could change the password, and then all you need to do is use the change password module command to make that change. So the other so kind of going down the list, those are some common things. Oh, I forgot about clearing your cache. So you probably are familiar with browser cache if you've done any helping folks with website stuff, but I wanted to point out a couple things, and I think we may need to update this, but refreshyourcache.com, this is a good resource, but I'm not sure how up to date this is anymore. Yeah, Google Chrome 27 is super old. So I will say, if you need a resource to point users to so they know how to clear their browser cache, we at Reclaim Hosting have our own documentation on that, and it goes over several different browsers. I would link to this if I were you. We've got one for Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Edge, Opera, and Brave. And I would use this because this is, at least for me, when I work on support tickets, this is something I end up sending to users pretty often. So there's a pretty good chance that we will be updating this for our own purposes before you would ever need to have your own version. So that's the main three things you want to make sure are set before you do anything more drastic. As far as other things that you may need to do administratively, a big one is changing a user's primary domain. And again, we have this documented, and it's pretty simple. But the first thing you need to make sure before you do any domain changes is that the domain isn't already used on the server. If it is, it'll give you an error when you're following these instructions. It's not the end of the world. It just the change won't go through. So you want to make sure that you can search on this on WHMCS, or you can just try to visit it in the web browser. That'd be a pretty good indication it's not really being used. But the big one is, all right, a user wants to change their subdomain on a domain of one's own. Once you're sure that's not being used, you would just go to their WHMCS profile, and you can change the domain in the panel there. The tricky thing with this is you also need to make this change in WHM. Unfortunately, this is one of those things that doesn't sync. So what you're doing is you're going into your WHM, and in my case, I'll go into State U here and log in.
I go to list accounts. Yeah.
Yeah. Normally you can actually search in the newer WHM from there too. I've gotten kind of used to that, but it's because I'm looking for I'm not. Yeah. Well, I need to find the actual username.
List accounts is always the answer.
Username /
in WHM it is, it, Lauren.
Yeah, list accounts is everything, honestly. Okay, so once you're in here, you modify the account, and you would be able to change the primary domain up here. And so you type in the new primary domain, and then you would save it. And it's important to note that when you're doing the second step here in WHMCS, that's really for your record keeping purposes, so that you don't have conflicting data. If you do this in WHMCS, it's not going to force that change on WHM.
Yeah, that's a great point. You have to change them in both places, because WHMCS is what's helping create that bridge between WordPress and the server, right? So having that in sync is really important. So after those changes are made in both places, you can click change password there, that module command, just to make sure everything is syncing up. One question that comes up here is also, okay, I'm changing the domain name. So can I change the cPanel username to match? That's easy if your cPanel is empty. Sure, go for it. If you've got stuff on your cPanel account and you try to change that cPanel username, you're going to break everything because that cPanel username is associated with database prefixes that, for all of your site installs. So it's purely backend stuff that so the answer is no, please don't change it, because it would be a very, very manual to go into every database and fix that. So we just say, change the project domain name, leave the cPanel username as is.
Yeah.
Cool.
Leave the gun, take the cannolis. And I think back to a point you made, the point before then, just as a kind of reassurance here and a reaffirmation, understanding how WHMCS links to WHM conceptually is a really big, if you're a starting admin, it's a really big kind of like hopefully aha moment or light bulb to understand by you changing it in WHM, but then you're syncing with it with WHMCS, because that's the place where all record keeping and accounting happens. So it's almost like you begin to understand through this process of changing a primary domain how those two systems relate. And I really believe that's a conceptual understanding that will help you down the road. So if you have questions about that, reach out to us. But like, it's a really important point to reinforce as you're getting familiar with how these things work together.
Awesome. So a couple other things that come up quite often as problems, and I think probably the most common one I see happen is folks that see that dreaded site URL in WordPress, and they want to change their domain name, and so they go into WordPress and change it there because there's a setting called WordPress address and site address. Frankly, I have no idea why this is in the user interface for WordPress, because anyone that is actually making that change on purpose probably could do it in a text file in a database, because you almost never would need to change it in the anyway. So what happens is someone will go, I have taylorjaden.com, but I want taylorjaden.coffee. And they don't really understand that they have to go register that domain name and all that stuff. Or maybe it's a subdomain thing and they're just trying to move to a different subdomain. They are conflating this field here in WordPress with them being able to change that. And the problem is WordPress really only wants to know this so that it knows the base URL of the site and can do its WordPressy magic, right? So if they change this here, what will happen is the WordPress site will no longer load if they change it to wherever the site is not installed. So how do you fix it? Well, you have to go fix it in the database. It's not too hard, but it is something you have to go into the database to do. So if I go in here and I totally did a bad job of prepping this here. So I'm going to quick flash install a WordPress site here on my stateu.org demo account. But what we'll do is we're going to go into PHP My Admin, and we can use the tables, the database tables in there to fix this.
And the reason that you have to go into the database directly is because when you fill out that settings field with something else and you change it in two places in the WordPress dashboard, the WordPress dashboard breaks, so you can't go back in there and change it in the same place. You have to go kind of behind the scenes into the database directly. You
lock yourself out essentially. And we get tickets from students who are like, or just people who have installed WordPress who are like, hey, I changed my site and it's no longer working.
Right. And while Taylor's working here, you can see the field in the settings place where he's making that change. But you'll notice he's changing it in two places, which means we're going to have to fix it in two places. But that's kind of the painful part of this is not only are you going to break the front end of your site, but you're actually going to break the back end dashboard as well. So, that's usually where you get a support request. Hey, I think I broke something. I can't even get back in to fix it. What's up? And so this is that handy trick where, okay, we're going to go back into the dashboard or to the database, I should say, and fix that.
It's nice too, because as Em brought it up in a previous session, you get a little glimpse into, database management with PHP My Admin as well, which is always a good tool if you haven't explored it yet to see.
Yeah, so this is a common kind of result here. So what you'll see is that there's actually some stuff loading, and this is mostly browser cache related that's even doing this. But if I go try and log into the dashboard, it's going to try to redirect me to a domain that doesn't even exist. So we have to fix this. So to do this, we go into phpMyAdmin. And again, you can do this right from the user's cPanel. So you would go to your WordPress site for your domains project, switch user to that person, and then you can go in so that you're in their cPanel, and you can go to phpMyAdmin from here. And I pretty much always use this search bar, but it is in the databases section. I always just type in phpMyAdmin, but you can also find it in databases. So once I click on that, it's going to bring me over there. And it's really important that you're looking at the correct database or database table if they have multiple different sites, or it could be WordPress sites, could be Omeka sites or whatever. If they have multiple sites and you see multiple entries in the left sidebar here, you're going to want to make sure you're looking at the right one.
Yeah.
You can easily see that in Installatron settings. If you go to the Installatron page and you go to the, I think it's the advanced tab of the application that you're looking at. So
Yeah, so if you view and edit the details, you can see it in files and tables. And it will give you the, well, that's the files. But at the bottom, it'll show you the name of the database right in here. I think advanced also shows it, but this is often where I will find it.
Actually, from that window, I believe if you scroll up, you can click directly on one of those links and it should take you into phpMyAdmin. So
yeah,
it's pretty slick.
You're right. So if you click on the folder up here, that would go into the file manager. I didn't even know that. And this one here will go right to the database. That's awesome.
It's
okay.
Beautiful.
That's cool. That's super awesome. So the first thing we'll want to do is go to WP options. That's the table in the database we want to look at. And we need to find the key for the site URL and home. So you can see here, those are both taylor.stateu.coffee. So I'm going to edit those. I could be wrong, but note that sometimes the ordering of this is different. So you may not always find these at the top. Am I misremembering that?
I think at the point that we wrote the documentation, one field was on page 1, the second field was on page 2. I think they have made changes where they've pushed both fields to the top, which is kind of nice. But the actual fields that you'll need to change, site URL, I believe is one, and the second one is home. Those, just be on the lookout for those.
Yeah, you can always, they will always be called home and site URL. So that's the real thing you're looking for. So I already did site URL, but before I do home here, I figured I should probably zoom in a little bit so this is a little bit more readable. So once you go to a key, and I'm going to go back before I change this. So once you just go to the row that has site URL and home, click edit, and then you'll fix the URL to what it was before. Note that in my opinion, it's better off to fix it back to the old URL and then ask them about where they would like to move their site, because that's probably a domain name change or a subdomain change like I just showed before, or maybe some other process.
The subdirectory is another one too, where I think, while you're making this change, I think when you're installing WordPress for the first time in Installatron, it will recommend a /blog subdirectory, and then folks will get in there and try and remove the /blog, and it still breaks things.
That's where the clone tool is great.
In my opinion, you're better off just fixing the site so it works by putting the URLs back to what they should be, and then using the Installatron clone tool to move it wherever they'd like it to be.
Yeah, to move it somewhere else in the cPanel directory, or if you're using an entirely different domain name and you need to change that at the cPanel level, that's where you would change it in WHMCS and WHM, kind of where we started the session.
It's also good to note and point out too that your options here are numerous in terms of where sites are. Like as we mentioned, you can add in a new subdomain to an existing account, but you can also move account to ownership to a different person and change that primary domain name or subdomain name. So there's a lot of options. And if you're confused about what might be the best way to do something, I would put in a ticket to support and say, here's the situation. We want to do this. What path would you recommend?
I also blogged about site organization and thinking about, okay, am I using subdomains, subdirectories? Should I use one cPanel or separate cPanels? And just thinking about scenarios where each of those makes sense. And I think, it's going to vary by user. It's going to vary by institution. I'll link to that. Let me find that blog post now.
Okay, so I've set the while you're looking for that, I've set the URL correctly here, and I'm going to need to go to the bottom of the page and hit go. It's super important. I've definitely forgotten that. It won't save anything. This isn't Google Docs until you tell it to go, because you're changing. It's go because you're like running SQL code, but it's really weird. I wish it was saved, but I understand their thought process.
So
I guess.
Is it working? Are we going to test it? Does it blend?
Does it blend? Let's see. If I go to taylor.stateu.org, whoops, let's make a new page.
It's funny because as you're doing this, one of the things
there you go
that I believe, let me just confirm this. Yeah, but one of the things that Jackie brought up was, if I have access to my host file, I can just change it to the mistaken domain and then change it and then, get it out of my host file. It's like, you're doing that on your host file, you are free and easy. You know what's going on, and that's awesome. So good for you. That is another way.
Host file modifications are for the real ones out there.
Yeah, exactly. I use them all the time because we have to, when you're doing migrations, you want to be able to see before you actually change the DNS. But all host files are doing is changing your DNS locally, so you can see what it will look like before you actually change the DNS. But DNS becomes a very powerful tool. We'll talk about it in another session, but it is definitely worth understanding some of that, even though it is complex and never predictable.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be 100% sure. I think in WordPress's case, on domain of one's own, that totally would work that way. But there are some applications that are very picky about when they will and will not work with host file change. The host file changes will work, but what I'm saying is the application may not always load properly with the host file change, especially if you have things like non-relative URLs and things like that. There are some weird cases where that doesn't work perfectly. And of course, the fact that it would only work on your computer.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Okay, so we are almost out of time because I am bad at pacing things. So some of these things we can get to later in another Q&A section if we have time. But again, they're all documented here, and I'm just going to kind of briefly breeze through them here, just so people are aware of what we're even talking about. This was brought up earlier. When you have a page that, like, the application will not load at all, or you get an error 500, you should use the file manager, go to where the application is installed. So in my case, for taylor.stateu.org, that's the main site at the root of that account. So that would be in public HTML. But if I made a subdomain, call it coffee.stateu.org, coffee's on the brain, that would be in a different folder, right? That would be at coffee.stateu.org. You should see an error log if it's a WordPress site, and you can open that error log up right in the file manager and scroll to the bottom of it to find the most recent stuff. And you should be able to see probably error references. Often it's a plugin or a theme that's bad. And you might go, well, how do I disable a plugin or a theme in WordPress if I can't even load WordPress? And the main thing you're going to do there is you're going to go in the file manager and rename the folder. We have a big guide on that. But basically you would go to the individual plugins path, and we have this documented here as an example for this Google Calendar events plugin in this case, and you just rename the folder. And again, this is also the kind of thing where if you're at this level of troubleshooting and you're not sure what to do, definitely feel free to reach out. We can help you and show you how you would deal with that next time. The last thing I want to mention is Jet Backup, and just that is also always available to users, and that's right in their cPanel. You can do file backups or database backups or the entire account. Oftentimes it's kind of nice to restore only the things or the folders that you want to restore and start there. But if you're not sure, or it's multiple sites that are messed up, the full account backups are also available to you right in there. So yeah, so with that, I'm trying to think. I'm still trying to recover from the speed of that session. So I got to look at our schedule here. So next session's at 2:35. It's supporting and administrating domains long term. So we're going to take a few minute break here, and then we'll meet you all over there. Is there anything else I
think that's good.
Okay.
I think that's everything.
Sweet.
See you soon.